Beneath the endless sky of the steppe, where the wind carries both silence and rumor, an empire once rose that bent kingdoms to its will. The Mongol dominion, stretching from the rivers of China to the gates of Europe, was more than a military machine. It was a crucible of terror and obedience, a theater of loyalty demanded and fear imposed. Imagine, if you will, a stone chamber lit by a single flickering candle. In the corners, shadows cling to the rough walls like silent witnesses. A heavy iron key turns in a lock, and the door creaks open. This is not merely a prison. It is a stage where the authority of the Khan is made visible, where disobedience is met with punishment so unforgettable that whispers of it travel farther than any written decree. The Mongol Khans, heirs of Genghis, ruled not only with armies, but with images of terror, carefully cultivated, never accidental. To understand their methods is not to revel in cruelty, but to confront how empires preserve dominion through theater. Tortures, whether threatened or enacted, became part of the script, warnings etched into memory, performed before courtiers, envoys, or enemies. Some of these punishments are known: executed generals, broken oaths repaid in blood. Others remain buried in chronicles, half-shaded by silence, dismissed by official scribes, preserved only in scattered accounts. This story does not seek to linger on pain. Instead, it unveils how terror itself was wielded as a weapon of governance. Each punishment, each whispered method, was a message: resist, and the empire will unmake you in body and in name. The Mongol Empire's genius was not merely conquest by horse and bow, but by crafting a legend of inevitability. The Khan's justice, terrible, unrelenting, reached across borders, over mountains, into the hearts of men. As ravens circled above distant battlefields, as parchment decrees traveled from Karakoram to Persia, so too did tales of punishments never seen, but always believed. Some of these practices may never be fully verified. Chroniclers, Persian and Chinese, sometimes embroidered with fear, sometimes with loathing. Yet behind the haze lies a consistent truth. Terror worked. Kings bowed their heads, merchants paid their tribute, and rebels thought twice before they dared to rise. In this narrative, we will walk through 5 chambers of this imperial theater. First, we shall see the world of the Khan, the court, the steppe, the philosophy of justice. Then, the rise of punishments as tools of power. We will uncover the conspiracy machine, the way whispers and accusations fed into spectacles of fear. We will witness trials, less about evidence than performance, more about the reminder of absolute dominion. Finally, we will stand at the edge of the scaffold, hearing the footsteps of those who faced their last dawn under Mongol rule. History remembers empires not only for their victories, but for the shadows they cast. And in the Mongol Empire, those shadows were long, cold, and unforgettable. Chapter I. The World, the Court. The Kingth Mongol Empire of the 13th century was unlike any realm the world had ever seen. At its height, it stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary, binding together cultures as disparate as Chinese, Persian, and Rus. Its breadth was its strength, but also its vulnerability, and the Khans who presided over this dominion understood that to hold such a vast territory, law and fear must march hand in hand. The world of the Mongol court was not built upon marble palaces or jewel thrones, as in Europe or Byzantium. It was born of the steppe, an empire carried on horseback, tents of felt and silk pitched wherever the Khan chose to rest. The royal encampment, the Ordo, was both humble and terrifying, humble in its materials, terrifying in its symbolism. Within the felt walls, decrees were issued that could fell a kingdom. Outside, banners snapped in the wind, bearing the falcon and horse-head standards of the Mongols. Each decision, each gesture, was magnified by the knowledge that disobedience invited not merely censure, but obliteration. The Khan and his authority at the center stood the Khan himself, supreme ruler, commander of armies, arbiter of law. Genghis Khan had forged the empire with an unbending vision of loyalty. His successors inherited not only territory, but also the conviction that their word carried divine sanction. The Khan was not a monarch in the European sense. He was the living axis between the eternal blue sky and the people of the steppe. To betray him was to betray the cosmic order. This cosmological dimension justified punishments that seemed excessive even to contemporaries. In Persian chronicles, we find accounts of princes executed not simply for rebellion, but for words that hinted at disloyalty. In Chinese annals, officials who faltered in duty were described as enduring punishments that ensured no one dared follow their example. Whether every detail is literal or embroidered, the underlying principle is clear. The Khan's power was absolute, his justice swift, his punishments crafted to be remembered. The courtly theatre of Mongol court was a place of paradox. Diplomats from distant lands arrived to find both austerity and spectacle. They might be offered fermented mare's milk, seated on carpets in great tents, treated with courtesy, yet always under the gaze of guards whose bows could silence them in an instant. The punishments that echoed through this world were not only about crime, they were about performance. To execute a rebellious prince before foreign envoys was to remind them of the cost of defiance. To stage the humiliation of a corrupt official before his peers was to reinforce discipline within the ranks. These acts were less private retribution than public theatre, designed to ripple outward through rumour and fear. The legal foundations behind this system lay the Yasa, the code of law attributed to Genghis Khan. Though scholars debate whether the Yasa was ever written in a single codex, its principles permeated Mongol governance: loyalty above all, protection of envoys, harsh penalties for theft, betrayal, or treason. Punishments were often collective, visiting ruin not only upon the guilty, but upon their kin. This, too, was intentional, a means of binding families, tribes, and officials ever more tightly to obedience. Torture, in this context, was rarely an end in itself. It was a means of extracting truth, enforcing confession, or creating a cautionary tale. Accounts speak of methods that exploited fear of the body's frailty without always ending in death. The Mongols understood that a punishment witnessed and remembered could be more powerful than one carried out in secrecy. The wider world infernos of these practices spread as quickly as the Mongol horsemen themselves. When European travelers or friars, merchants, or envoys carried back stories of Mongol justice, they emphasized the severity, sometimes embellishing for dramatic effect. To kings in France or Poland, the Mongol punishments became legends of terror, cautionary tales of an empire ruled by iron will. In Persia and the Middle East, memories of Mongol justice lingered long after the armies had withdrawn, shaping local chronicles with both horror and grudging respect. The ravens circling over battlefields were joined, in imagination, by the whispers of punishment in stone corridors of conquered cities. Candlelight flickering over parchment decrees carried the weight not just of law but of dread. Even when the empire fractured into khanates, in Persia, in the Golden Horde, in Yuan China, the motif of fear remained a shared inheritance. The king's dilemma for the Khans themselves. The challenge was always balance. Excessive cruelty could breed rebellion, but leniency could invite contempt. Their punishments, then, were crafted not as random acts of rage, but as deliberate signals. To a disloyal noble, your betrayal will not only cost you your life, but will erase your lineage. To a corrupt official, your disgrace will be made into a warning sung by others. To a foreign ruler, this fate could be yours, should you resist tribute. The genius of Mongol power lay not only in the horse and bow, but in the calculated display of punishment. Terror was not chaotic, it was curated, and like actors upon a stage, courtiers, generals, and even conquered kings learn their roles within this grim theatre. Thus the world of the Mongol court emerges before us, a place where the Khan ruled as the embodiment of divine order, where the Ordo's felt walls contained both hospitality and menace, and where punishments served not simply as penalties, but as instruments of empire. The candlelight in those great tents illuminated more than feasts. It lit the faces of men who knew that obedience was life, and defiance meant becoming part of a legend no one wished to share. Chapter 2. The Rissith Mongol Empire did not invent cruelty, nor was it alone in punishing dissent. But what distinguished it was the deliberate refinement of terror into policy. To understand the rise of Mongol punishments, we must trace the path from Genghis Khan's unification of the steppe to the elaboration of a system where fear became as potent as cavalry. Chapter 2. The Rissith Mongol Empire did not invent cruelty, nor was it alone in punishing dissent. But what distinguished it was the deliberate refinement of terror into policy. To understand the rise of Mongol punishments, we must trace the path from Genghis Khan's unification of the steppe to the elaboration of a system where fear became as potent as cavalry. From tribe to empirean, the earliest years of Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, survival itself was precarious. Rival tribes raided livestock, families were exiled, and vengeance was pursued across generations. In this world, loyalty was a fragile bond, broken as swiftly as it was pledged. Temujin understood that to transform shifting alliances into lasting unity, he needed both reward and punishment. When he rose to supreme power, he established laws that demanded absolute obedience. Rewards for fidelity were lavish: wealth, command, and status. Punishments for betrayal were stark: erasure, exile, or death. In this dual system, terror was not arbitrary, but essential to maintaining cohesion among clans whose loyalty had never before been bound to a single ruler. The expansion of fear is, the empire expanded beyond the steppes. So too did its repertoire of punishments. In China, the Mongols encountered bureaucratic traditions of surveillance and discipline. In Persia and the Islamic world, they confronted both Islamic jurisprudence and long memories of dynastic vengeance. The Mongols absorbed, adapted, and sharpened these practices into their own system. Here lay their innovation. Punishments were not merely private reckonings, but public spectacles. Rebels were punished in sight of their kin. Envoys were protected with severe threats. Conquered rulers were sometimes humiliated in ways that resounded far beyond the battlefield. Each act became a message inscribed not only upon the victim, but upon the imagination of all who heard. Legends of punishmentarities whisper of punishments designed to strike at pride as much as flesh. A noble who defied the Khan to be bound in iron chains, paraded before his followers, his disgrace a performance meant to break the spirit of his allies. Accounts speak of rulers suffocated without shedding blood, a method both practical and symbolic. The execution left no dishonorable spillage, yet made the point that defiance led only to silence. Whether every tale is accurate cannot be known. Chroniclers, writing decades later, often embroidered their accounts to heighten the aura of Mongol terror. Yet even exaggeration reveals a truth. Contemporaries believed the Mongols capable of such acts. The mere rumor of punishment was itself a weapon. Torture as interrogation in this period. Torture also rose as a tool for gathering information. Spies, conspirators, and suspected traitors might be subjected to ordeals designed less to kill than to extract confession. Here again, the Mongols were pragmatic. They did not torture indiscriminately, for it consumed time and resources. Instead, they used it selectively, when information was needed urgently or when confession would serve as spectacle. The methods employed often reflected cultural exchanges. Techniques known in the Islamic world appear in Persian accounts of Mongol trials. Chinese chronicles suggest that the Mongols adopted practices of corporal discipline from dynasties they conquered. What emerged was a hybrid system, a grim tapestry of punishments woven from many traditions, unified by a single purpose: to remind all that the Khan's justice was inescapable. The role of fear in diplomacy, perhaps most striking, was how the Mongols exported their system of fear into diplomacy. When foreign envoys arrived at the Ordo, they were treated with solemn respect, but always with reminders of the fate of those who had violated Mongol law. Tales of envoys executed by defiant kings and the subsequent annihilation of those kingdoms circulated widely. The story of the Khwarezmian Shah, who dared to kill Mongol envoys, became legendary. His entire empire was obliterated in retaliation. This was not merely war, it was punishment elevated to international theatre. The Khwarezmian fate became a cautionary tale told in courts from Cairo to Paris. Do not defy the Mongols, or your realm may follow. The machinery of Tur'orbi, the mid-13th century. Punishments had become institutionalized. The Darogachi, or overseers, appointed by the Khans in conquered cities, enforced Mongol rule with severity. Local populations came to dread the possibility of being summoned before these officials. In some cases, whole communities were disciplined collectively, with executions or humiliations staged in public squares. The rise of this machinery reveals the genius of Mongol governance. They ruled not only by cavalry, but by imagination. Fear allowed a relatively small ruling elite to dominate vast populations. Where armies could not be present, memory and rumor took their place. A whisper of what had happened in one province could prevent rebellion in another. The balance of justice. The Mongols did not see themselves as wanton in cruelty. In their eyes, punishments were justice, ordained by the eternal blue sky. Theft, betrayal, treason, all were offenses against the cosmic order. To punish them harshly was not barbarity, but necessity. In their view, without such measures, the empire would dissolve into the anarchy of the steppe from which it had emerged. Thus, in the rise of Mongol punishments, we see not random acts of savagery, but a carefully constructed system. It grew from the tribal struggles of Temujin's youth, absorbed practices from conquered lands, and blossomed into an imperial theatre where law, terror, and spectacle merged. The ravens of rumor carried these tales across mountains and deserts, alighting in courts far from the Mongol heartland. By the time Genghis Khan's grandsons sat upon the throne, the legend of Mongol punishments had already become a force as powerful as their armies. Chapter 3. The conspiracy machine within the felt walls of the Ordo, where the candlelight flickered against banners and iron keys clinked on the belts of guards. Power did not merely rest upon open conquest. It thrived on suspicion, on whispered plots, on the constant weaving of loyalty and betrayal. The Mongol Empire, vast and diverse, was not only a field of armies, but a labyrinth of intrigues. And in this labyrinth, punishments, or real and rumored, were the gears of a great conspiracy machine. Whispers in the 10th Mongol court was never free of whispers. A Khan might rise to power through election by the Kurultai, but his throne was never secure. Rival princes, ambitious generals, even foreign advisors, all harbored hopes and fears. Accusations of treason were frequent, for in a world where betrayal was both feared and expected, to accuse first was often to survive. It was in this climate that punishments took on their most insidious role. Torture became not merely interrogation, but performance. An accused conspirator paraded before the court, pressed for confession, his words recorded on parchment as a warning. Some yielded, naming accomplices to preserve themselves a little longer. Others resisted, and their silence was interpreted as guilt. Either way, the machine fed upon itself, churning fear into loyalty. The role of the Jarguchi central to this system were the Jarguchi, the imperial judges. They were not neutral arbiters in the modern sense, but instruments of the Khan's will. Their task was to transform suspicion into verdict, rumor into law. When a conspiracy was alleged, it was the Jarguchi who orchestrated the proceedings, sometimes extending the process through calculated displays of intimidation. Here, torture was both tool and symbol. To see an accused noble under duress reminded all that no status was immune. To hear his broken voice naming others spread suspicion like wildfire. The court became a stage upon which guilt was manufactured, and fear ensured obedience. The web of accusation tricklists describe how accusations multiplied like shadows in torchlight. One man's confession would implicate another, who in turn would name a third. Soon a web of supposed conspirators emerged, sometimes real, often imagined. Whether true or false, the process served the Khan. Rivals were eliminated, factions weakened, loyalty reaffirmed. This was the genius of the conspiracy machine. It did not require truth to function. What mattered was the appearance of vigilance, the demonstration that the Khan's justice would root out treachery wherever it hid. In such a world, silence was dangerous, but speech could be fatal. The safest course was obedience. The theatre of punishments themselves were staged as theatre. When conspirators were condemned, their fate was not hidden in a dungeon. It was displayed before courtiers, envoys, and sometimes even the public. A disgraced prince might be executed without shedding blood, suffocated beneath a carpet, his body removed in silence. The message was clear. The Khan could erase even his own kin without dishonor. In other cases, punishments were designed to humiliate as much as to destroy. Officials stripped of rank were paraded through the encampment, their disgrace magnified by the gaze of their peers. Envoys carried these stories abroad, ensuring that foreign courts knew the price of treachery. The effect was cumulative. Even those never accused lived with the constant awareness that their loyalty might be questioned. Fear became not only external but internal, each noble watching his peers, each official second-guessing his words. A culture of surveillance conspiracy machine thrived because it was embedded in culture. Mongol rulers expected absolute loyalty, but they also expected vigilance. Generals were judged not only on battlefield victories, but on their ability to detect disloyalty. Families were bound by collective responsibility. If one member betrayed, all might suffer. This culture created a society where surveillance was not imposed from above, but enacted by all. Brothers monitored brothers, vassals monitored lords, servants reported on masters. Even rumors of disloyalty could be enough to summon the Jarguchi. The walls of the Ordo seemed to listen, the candlelight itself to whisper. The limits of terror, yet the conspiracy machine was not infallible. Excessive purges risked weakening the empire, removing capable leaders for the sake of suspicion. Chroniclers note moments when Khans themselves hesitated, balancing the need for fear with the need for stability. Too much terror could breed rebellion, too little could invite betrayal. This balance was never perfect. The death of Gedai Khan, for example, unleashed rival factions that accused each other of conspiracy, plunging the empire into cycles of suspicion. Later Khans sought to control the machine, but it was like a forge that once stoked could not easily be called. Terror beyond the steppeth conspiracy machine was not confined to the Mongol elite. In conquered territories, local elites were drawn into its gears. Governors accused of withholding tribute, merchants suspected of deceit, even scholars whose words displeased, all could be subjected to Mongol justice. Here, too, punishments served not only to correct, but to intimidate entire populations. Persian chroniclers describe officials flayed in rumor, though rarely in literal truth, their disgrace magnified in memory. Chinese records note the punishments of corrupt administrators as warnings to others, whether or not the full severity was enacted. The legend of Mongol punishments kept subject peoples wary. Ravens and shadows. As we move through this chapter, the recurring motif emerges again. Ravens circling above a field, shadows stretching long across the steppe. These images mirrored the way fear spread, silent, watchful, inevitable. The conspiracy machine was less about what was done in truth than what was believed. The Mongols understood this instinctively. They did not need every punishment to be witnessed. They needed only enough to keep the rumor alive. A whisper in Samarkand could prevent rebellion in Bukhara. A tale told in a caravanserai could dissuade a merchant from dishonesty. The empire ruled by rumor as much as by bow. The human course behind this machinery lay human stories, men and women accused, sometimes guilty, often innocent, families shattered, lineages extinguished, communities silenced. These were not numbers, but lives, woven into the tapestry of empire as sacrifices to stability. To the Mongols, this was necessary. To us, it is sobering. Yet in acknowledging the human cost, we also see the resilience of those who endured. Some bent to the machine, confessing under duress to save their kin. Others resisted, holding to silence even as suspicion consumed them. Their names may be lost, but their defiance lingers in the chronicles that dared to note dissent. The machine's legacy be the late 13th century. The conspiracy machine was an entrenched feature of Mongol rule. It bound the empire together even as it sowed distrust. It allowed khans to eliminate rivals, yet it also eroded trust within their courts. Its legacy persisted long after the empire fractured, shaping the governance of successor states that inherited both Mongol law and Mongol fear. Thus, the conspiracy machine reveals the deeper truth of Mongol punishments. They were not merely acts of cruelty, but instruments of governance. They created a world where fear was constant, loyalty was fragile, and the shadow of suspicion fell upon all. The candle burns low in the ordo, its smoke curling upward like a raven taking flight. The conspiracy machine has done its work. Now we move to the next act, the trial, where justice is staged not in whispers, but in open theatre, and where punishment becomes performance before the eyes of the world. Chapter 4. The trial as theatre in the Mongol Empire. Justice was never a private matter. It was a public proclamation, a spectacle designed to bind the living to obedience through the fate of the accused. If the conspiracy machine worked in shadows and whispers, the trial was its grand unveiling, a performance before courtiers, generals, envoys, and sometimes entire cities. The trial was not only about guilt or innocence, it was about message, memory, and the absolute authority of the Khan. The stage of judgment picture, the ordo at dawn, felt tense arrayed in a circle, guards standing with bows at rest, banners of horsehair swaying in the wind. At the center, a raised dais, or carpet, where the Khan or his appointed judges presided. Around them, nobles, officials, and emissaries gathered in tense silence. This was the courtroom of empire, not carved stone, but open step, its grandeur carried in authority rather than architecture. When the accused was brought forward, the trial began as theatre. Charges were read aloud, often written on parchment, so that the words themselves carried permanence. Witnesses were called, though their testimonies were less about evidence than about affirming loyalty. To speak against the accused was to prove fidelity. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. The Jarguchi at work Jarguchi, those imperial judges, orchestrated the drama with practiced skill. Their role was not neutral inquiry, but choreography. They managed the rhythm of questions, the staging of confessions, the flow of accusation and denial. Torture, if applied, was not hidden but presented as proof of determination. A broken voice confessing guilt was as much a performance as a verdict. The Mongols did not pretend to the fiction of impartiality. Everyone present knew the trial's true function, to reinforce the Khan's dominion. What mattered was not justice in our modern sense, but the reaffirmation that treachery would be punished and loyalty rewarded. Trials of princes, and nobles' most dramatic trials, involved princes of the blood, rival heirs, suspected plotters, ambitious cousins. All might find themselves summoned before judgment. Here, the stakes were not only life or death, but the legitimacy of dynastic power. When a prince was condemned, the punishment was carried out with deliberate symbolism. Execution by sword was often avoided, for to spill noble blood was taboo. Instead, suffocation beneath a carpet, or another method deemed honorable, ensured the punishment was remembered without dishonor to the lineage. The trial thus served as a ritual of legitimacy, the Khan demonstrating his power even over kin, yet upholding tradition. Trials as diplomacy. Foreign envoys often witnessed these proceedings. To see a Mongol noble condemned before their eyes was to carry home a message. The Khan ruled with iron certainty. For emissaries of kingdoms wavering in their submission, such trials were warnings more effective than any battle. In some cases, foreign captives themselves were placed on trial. A defiant ruler brought before the Mongol court might be interrogated, judged, and punished in full view of others. The message was unmistakable. Kings themselves could be made actors in the Khan's theatre. Collective trials. Mongols also staged collective trials, in which entire groups were judged together. A clan accused of rebellion, a garrison suspected of betrayal, a guild of merchants caught in deceit. All might stand before the judges as one body. The verdict, too, was collective, reminding all that loyalty was not individual but communal. This practice reinforced the bonds of responsibility. One person's treachery could do many, binding communities to enforce their own discipline. The ritual of confession central to these trials was confession. The Mongols valued it as a sign of submission, a symbolic surrender of will. Whether freely given or extracted under duress, confession transformed the accused from threat to example. Chroniclers record instances of nobles confessing and begging forgiveness, only to be executed anyway, their pleas serving as final reinforcement of Mongol power. The ritual was grim but effective. Those who watched learned that even confession could not erase guilt, that only absolute loyalty, proven by action, ensured survival. The audience's Raleigh trial's true power lay in its audience. Nobles watched with their futures in mind. Officials absorbed the lesson for their own governance. Envoys memorized the details to repeat in foreign courts. The trial was designed to be retold, reshaped into rumor and legend. Each retelling magnified the Khan's authority. A candlelit chamber in Persia might echo with whispers of a trial held years earlier in Karakoram. A European monastery might record in its chronicle tales of Mongol justice passed on by merchants. Thus the trial extended beyond its immediate audience, becoming part of the empire's long-distance rule through fear and memory. The fragility beneath the theatre riot beneath the grandeur. The theatre revealed fragility. Trials were needed because suspicion was constant, because loyalty was never assured. The very frequency of trials betrayed the insecurity of Mongol power. Behind every spectacle lay the truth that empire held together only through vigilance and intimidation. At times, trials backfired. Excessive purges removed capable leaders, creating vacuums of command. Rival factions accused each other to weaken opposition, turning trials into weapons of politics. In these moments, the theatre of justice threatened to consume the actors themselves. The legacy of Mongol trials, despite these dangers, the tradition endured. In successor khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan dynasty, the trial as theatre remained central. It became part of the Mongol legacy, blending with local traditions, but retaining its essence: justice as performance, punishment as proclamation. The motif of ravens returns here. As trials concluded, and condemned men were led away, witnesses described the silence of those present, a silence broken only by the imagined beating of wings. The raven, carrion bird of the steppe, became in memory the symbol of Mongol justice, dark, inevitable, circling overhead toward the final morning. As we leave this chapter, the stage is set for the final act. The conspiracy machine has whispered its accusations. The trial has displayed its theatre. What remains is the climax, the sentence carried out, the spectacle complete, the final mourning of those condemned. It is here, in the rituals of punishment and execution, that Mongol power revealed its starkest truth, that fear itself was the strongest bond of empire. Chapter V: The Sentence, Spectacle, and Final Mourning. When the trial concluded, and the parchment of verdict was rolled and sealed, the machinery of Mongol justice turned toward its climax. The sentence was not an afterthought, but the most important act in the theatre of power. How a punishment was carried out mattered as much as the verdict itself, for the execution was the moment when fear was most vividly inscribed upon memory. The ritual of sentencing and Mongol practice. Sentencing was announced with solemnity. The accused, whether noble or commoner, was presented before the court, and the judgment was declared aloud. The language was formulaic, invoking the eternal blue sky, the authority of the Khan, and the binding force of the law. To hear one's fate pronounced in this way was to feel the empire itself speaking through the judge. Sometimes, sentencing was delayed, stretched across days to heighten anticipation. In these intervals, the condemned lived in the shadow of death, and the court itself absorbed the spectacle of suspense. The waiting became part of the punishment. As courtiers speculated on the manner of execution, and envoys prepared to carry the tale home. Methods and meanings. The Mongols were deliberate in choosing methods of execution. For nobles of high blood, spilling blood was taboo. Thus, suffocation beneath a felt carpet became the favored means, a punishment at once intimate, silent, and laden with symbolism. To die in this way was to be erased without dishonor, a paradoxical act of both respect and terror. For others, methods varied. Some were executed swiftly with the sword, the act performed publicly, so that all might see the swiftness of Mongol justice. Others were paraded before crowds, humiliated before their deaths to emphasize not only the penalty, but the dishonor. Chroniclers, particularly in Persia, speak of officials forced to watch their peers punished, so that fear might enter their very bones. Rumors of more elaborate tortures circulated, some likely exaggerated. Chinese records mention punishments adapted from earlier dynasties. Persian accounts describe methods too grim to be repeated in detail. Whether fact or fable, these tales magnified the legend of Mongol cruelty, ensuring that the fear of what might be was as powerful as what truly was. The final mourning for the condemned. The last mourning was a ritual unto itself. Guards came at dawn, the iron keys clinking as doors were unlocked. A thin light entered the tent or chamber, revealing faces drawn in silence. The condemned were led forth into the cold air of the steppe, of the stone courts of conquered cities. Chroniclers often describe the stillness of these moments. There was little shouting, little noise. The Mongols believed that justice should speak for itself, that spectacle did not require chaos. The condemned might be allowed a final word, though such pleas were seldom heeded. More often, they were presented to the court or to the assembled audience as silent symbols of disobedience undone. Envoys carried these images with them, repeating them in foreign courts. The prince who vanished beneath a carpet, the governor paraded in disgrace, the rebels struck down before their kin. Each retelling magnified the effect. The punishment did not end with death, it lived on as story. Collective punishments secondly memorable were collective punishments. A clan convicted of rebellion might be executed together. Their erasure meant to remind others that disloyalty endangered not only oneself, but one's entire kin. Communities might be forced to watch as leaders fell, ensuring the lesson was not forgotten. These acts, harsh as they were, reveal the Mongols' understanding of loyalty as collective. To them, treachery was never individual. It was a wound that could spread through a family, a tribe, a city. By punishing together, they sought to cauterize the wound, however brutal the method. The spectacle for the world spectacle of Mongol punishments extended beyond the court. Stories of executions traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants, envoys, and pilgrims. In Europe, tales of Mongol cruelty became legends, magnified by distance and fear. In Persia and the Middle East, they entered chronicles tinged with bitterness and awe. In China, records preserved both the severity of punishment and the efficiency it maintained. In every case, the spectacle served the same purpose, to preserve empire through dread. A rebellion might be crushed by force, but the memory of its punishment prevented the next rebellion from rising. Mercy as contrasted, the Mongols also understood the power of mercy. Occasionally, a condemned man was pardoned, his sentence commuted. Such acts were rare, but precisely for that reason they were powerful. Mercy proved that the Khan could be both terrible and benevolent, that survival lay in obedience. A single pardon could inspire greater loyalty than dozens of executions, but only because the shadow of punishment loomed so large behind it. The end of the spectacle asterisk as the condemned fell silent, and the court dispersed. The empire moved forward, but the echoes of each execution lingered. Courtiers remembered the faces of those who had stood accused. Envoys carried the tales across continents. Families lived under the shadow of disgrace for generations. The Mongols had turned punishment into an art of memory. Their methods ensured that even when the empire fractured, the legend of Mongol justice remained. Ravens circling above empty fields, candle smoke curling in the silence of tents, iron keys turning in locks. These images became part of the imagination of empire, symbols of a rule sustained not only by conquest but by fear. Thus ends the spectacle, not in gore or frenzy, but in silence, in ritual, in memory. And yet the story does not end here. For every execution is behind a legacy, every punishment an echo. The true measure of Mongol justice lies not only in how it was carried out, but in what followed, the aftermath, the legacy, the echoes that reached beyond empire into legend. Epilogue: aftermath, legacy. An echo swan. The Mongol Empire fractured into its successor khanates. The machinery of punishment did not vanish. It was inherited, adapted, and remembered. In Persia, the Ilkhans retained the practice of public trials and severe sentences, though blended with Islamic jurisprudence. In China, the Yuan dynasty formalized punishments within imperial bureaucracy, balancing Mongol severity with Chinese tradition. In the Golden Horde, collective responsibility and fear of treachery remained cornerstones of governance. The legacy of Firth. True legacy of Mongol punishments was not in the specific methods, whether suffocation beneath the carpet or execution before a crowd, but in the system they represented. The Mongols demonstrated that fear could serve as governance, that rumor could substitute for armies, that a single trial could do the work of 10 battles. This legacy endured long after Mongol banners had faded. In Russia, the memory of Mongol punishments influenced the rise of autocracy. In Persia, chronicles described Mongol severity as both horror and necessity, shaping how later dynasties conceived of justice. In Europe, the image of Mongol cruelty remained a cautionary tale, part of the myth of the Tartar yoke. The ambiguity of memory was never simple. To some, Mongol justice was barbarity. To others, it was efficiency. Chroniclers sometimes exaggerated, embellishing punishments to heighten the aura of terror. But exaggeration itself testifies to effectiveness. People believed the Mongols capable of the worst, and that belief restrained rebellion. Even today, the image of Mongol cruelty persists more vividly than their systems of trade, their promotion of tolerance, their networks of exchange. The punishments, though few in number compared to the conquests, have become emblematic. Shadows often outlive substance. The human course remembered for all its political logic. The machinery of terror left deep scars. Families erased, communities shattered, voices silenced. These were the hidden costs. The Mongol chronicles, terse in their accounts, seldom lingered on the grief of survivors. But in the silences between the lines, one may hear the echoes of mourning. Children who never saw fathers return, wives who carried disgrace, servants who whispered of vanished masters. The final imagev motifs remain: ravens wheeling above fields long emptied, stone corridors echoing with silence, candlelight guttering as parchment decrees are sealed. The iron key turns once more, locking away the chamber of Mongol punishments, but not erasing its memory. History judges empires not only by their victories, but by their shadows. The Mongols, unmatched in conquest, also mastered the art of fear. Their punishments, whether real or rumored, became instruments of empire, binding vast territories through obedience born of dread. That is their paradoxical legacy, a system both ingenious and terrible, both effective and destructive. And so, as we leave the world of tents and trials, conspiracies and spectacles, we are left with a question: what holds empires together? Is it the loyalty freely given, or the fear carefully cultivated? The Mongols answered in their own way. The echoes of that answer still resonate, centuries later. Whenever power chooses to govern through terror, rather than trust. Call to action: if this story has illuminated a corner of history had not seen before, consider continuing the journey. The Mongol world was vast, its shadows long, its lessons sobering. By exploring it further, we confront not only their empire, but the perennial question of how power rules and how it falls.